the digital revolution no longer needs any support or subsidy from government, from the state. On the contrary, it's matured to the point where it is attacking the authority of the state at multiple levels and along multiple dimensions, and even undermining the integrity of the political process on which ultimately the authority of the state rests.
That was the voice of Bill Janeway, a storied venture capitalist and economist. And I am Azeem Azhar, your host on the Exponential View podcast. Welcome to the next episode of our season where we're exploring the political economy of technology. As you heard, Bill doesn't hold back his views on how the digital economy has become imbalanced. Power seems to have accreted some of the dominant players, possibly at the expense of the very institutions that allowed them to form. In this discussion, Bill and I dig deep into what he calls the three-player game, the relationship between founders, investors, and the state. What went right, what has gone wrong, and how we need to fix it. This conversation is enlightening, informative, and challenging, but unfortunately it was recorded over a long-distance phone line, so at times the sound quality isn't where I would like it to be. But stick with us. I'm sure you'll find it worthwhile. For the next few weeks, the Exponential View podcast is sponsored by Spotify. Like many of you, I've been using it as my music platform of choice, so it's exciting that Spotify is also getting into the spoken word through its new podcast service. Just open the app and search for your favourite podcast, Exponential View. And now, over to my conversation with Bill.
Good morning, Bill. It's great to have you.
Good morning, Azeem. It's delightful to join you.
Now, the one downside of our podcast today is that you're not sitting in the same room as me. I'm in London. Where do I find you today?
Well, I am in a very special place. I'm on the down east coast of Maine, beyond Penobscot Bay, across from Bar Harbor, in an old-fashioned summer community which has 4 tennis courts, a wharf, a lovely public library, and an aggressively non-denominational chapel, and no clubs. Perfect place to read, write, and think. And that's where I'm spending the summer.
It sounds like you have found a place which is about as far away from digital distractions as it could be. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, in fact, over the course of the 40 years that my wife and I have been coming here in the summer, we can track the entire progress of digital communications with precision. Because when we first arrived, we had the second smallest post office in North America, and the phone lines were 4-way party line telephones. Over the years, we saw cordless phones come in, FedEx come to the local airport. Then one day I was out running, and I noticed there were these thick cables between the telephone poles, and oh my God, cable TV came, and then eventually came broadband internet as well as FedEx to the door. So I'm afraid that we are connected, but the trade-off is we get to stay here longer because we are connected.
It's amazing that you've been able to track those developments over the 4-decade period. That sort of coincides with your career as a venture capitalist as well, I guess. I was fascinated that you described yourself as an academic who took an extended sabbatical from academia. Could you just say a little bit about your sort of founding story?
Sure. So I graduated from Princeton University in 1965 and had the enormous good fortune to win a Marshall Scholarship, which I took to Cambridge University because as an undergraduate, I had been taken with the vision of John Maynard Keynes. And I had the second privilege at Cambridge over the course of 4 years of writing a PhD thesis for Richard Kahn, arguably Keynes's number one student, who was the author of The Multiplier, most notably. And as I look back across the Atlantic, vintage 1970, economics in the United States had taken the turn that was determinative over the next long generation. New Cambridge, MIT, Paul Samuelson and Bob Solow, great economists, but had launched the discipline and the direction which assumed a sort of rational omniscience, which was the absolute opposite of the core of Keynes's understanding of how people incapable of knowing the full consequences of their actions nonetheless have to take decisions that will often produce conflict, contestation, and market failure. So in any case, I decided to experiment outside of the academy and discovered my path towards what was just beginning to be known as venture capital during the course of the 1970s when I joined an old-fashioned, that word again, specialist investment firm in New York that was focused on the science-based industries. And that's where I discovered computers. I discovered the potential of computers. And the next 25 years through the great dot-com internet bubble were consumed with total immersion in the emerging world of information technology, distributed computing, and eventually the internet as an environment for economic life, not just for targeted communication. And then I completed the cycle in 2006 when I retired as vice chairman of Warburg Pincus, which I had joined in 1988, and returned to Cambridge with my wife as a kind of experiment in withdrawal. And then the global financial crisis of 2008 made economics a really interesting subject again. And so I'm back in the economics faculty of Cambridge 50 years later.
It's an amazing journey, and within that, I think we see the sort of intellectual antecedents of the book that you have recently published a second edition of, where you look at this trifecta of the mission-driven state, which is, I guess, a kind of Keynesian idea, financial speculation and venture investing, and the market economy. And you take a look at those three things. And of course, you also talked a little bit about Bob Solow and that consensus. You also have a hard look at the rational expectations and efficient market hypothesis. And I think these are some of the things that I'd love to cover off over the next the next minute. But before we get there, I'd love to just drill a little bit into your experience as a venture capitalist. I mean, I think you're best associated with two quite fundamental companies, Nuance, the voice recognition company, and I think it's BEA Systems, which is a sort of an application platform. In your time as a venture capitalist, what did you notice about what made technologies and teams be the sorts of things that you wanted to back and support?
Well, I had a kind of epiphany first in the late 1970s. It's not much remembered now, but once upon a time, the exploration of the world economy as a complex system had been initiated at MIT by an extraordinary man and an extraordinary team who unfortunately produced a fiasco called the Limited Growth Project of the Club of Rome. And they had attempted to model the world economy without a price system. And when this was pointed out, the group dissolved. But some of the youngsters, the young guys, were kind of refugees from MIT economics and from MIT engineering. But they set out to build a bottom-up set of models of the economy, which I stumbled on in the aftermath of the first oil crisis, when the conventional economic forecasting models had failed. This was when I was living a kind of hybrid life between economics and technology. And when I saw what they were doing, the simulation models they were building, a very large penny dropped. And I realized that computers were not just flexible typewriters or faster accounting machines, that they could be used to model and explore systems too complex to analyze exhaustively in an abstract way. That led me into real engagement with what was then the frontier of computing, and in particular, an extraordinary place that many people have heard of course, called Xerox PARC. Mm-hmm. And I got to know John Seely Brown even before he became director of the PARC. And that was really an opportunity to not just envision, but to play with the future that was not yet ready to be commercially implemented. PCs they weren't PCs, they were very powerful computers with custom processors, but that operated the way we now take for granted with graphical user interfaces and mice, but that also were networked together and networked to specialist computers that perform aspects of the system, database, algorithmic, intensive graphics, all that stuff that over the next 20 years became the new architecture that displaced the old centralized, proprietary, vertically integrated, closed systems produced by the giants of the industry, such as IBM and Digital Equipment. So I got in very early, by 1980, in what was beginning to smell like a world-changing, economy-changing, technological transformation. And along the way, I discovered, it was impressed upon me by reality, that what I was up to and what my peers were up to in the venture capital world and the entrepreneurs that we were all backing were up to was dancing on a platform that had been constructed by the United States government. In the decades after World War II, the U.S. Defense Department, even before DARPA was established in response to Sputnik in 1957, the Defense Department had funded upstream research across the entire array of components from silicon to software that came to combine to create the digital revolution. But also, and this is often missed, a really important role was that the Defense Department or agencies of it were early customers for the output of that research that was not by any means ready for commercial prime time. So they pulled the vendors, the Intels, for example, the Texas Instruments, down the learning curve to low-cost, reliable production that became capable of the extraordinary proliferation of computing, the democratization of computing from the 1980s on through the PC revolution and onto the internet. So that history was something I really lived and came to grips with as a practitioner, as a working venture capitalist, trying to understand the context which had enabled me and the people I was both competing with and collaborating with to develop this new industry.
That's fascinating. So, just to summarize what I understood from that, this is really the first leg of the thesis in your book, which is that the state and state funding plays a key role as being an enabler in these very deep innovations that we certainly saw in the period of the mid-70s through to the perhaps the early 90s. And
exactly right.
Yeah, and what I'm surprised to hear from you is that you had noticed that and you were kind of clearly aware of that, and people around you were aware of that narrative as you were interacting in those early days. Was it as really as sort of proximate and clear that you could draw the line between something that DARPA might have been doing and some great innovation that you were backing?
Well, certainly. The most obvious and transformational of all was DARPA's initiation of the internet. It was originally called ARPANET. Mm-hmm. And that was an experiment that the Defense Department had enough extraordinary. Actually, I have to pause for a moment just to say that the history of DARPA represents a really extraordinary demonstration of creative entrepreneurship in the public sector that in turn led to the transformation of the private sector. In 1982, when he became president, Ronald Reagan notoriously said, government isn't the solution, government is the problem. But believe me, all of the pioneers of the internet and, for good or ill, the applications of the internet, none of those pioneers would have agreed with President Reagan. On the contrary, the government was their collaborative, constructive, supportive partner in exploring the frontier of the digital technology.
Yeah, but when I think about what I hear coming out of government, and I mean the US, and certainly the US even pre-Trump, and in the UK, and the way they think about their role in the innovation ecosystem, I still feel that they are slightly stinging from Reagan's rebuke, and it prevents them from being as bullish or optimistic. And I find it quite curious that one of the phrases that the YouTube videos that's often used by investors and founders to motivate their teams is Kennedy's speech, where he says, "We choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, we choose to go because it is hard." And he was, of course, a government guy as well. And something happened in that period where we took a volte-face on what we thought the capabilities of the state in this arena might be.
Well, I think we're going to get to that as we discuss what's happened, what's become apparent over the 6 years from when I first launched this concept of the three-player game between the mission-driven state, financial speculators, and the market economy. What we're talking about now, this history of the role of the U.S. government in initiating and supporting and fostering the digital revolution, represented a kind of really remarkably constructive configuration of that game. And of course, that became clear and to the enormous benefit of those who had been the early practitioners during the great dot-com internet bubble, financial bubble, at the end of the 1990s, at the end of the 20th century, when all of a sudden those investors looking for the kind of discontinuity and disruption that creates the potential for super profits realized that what was going on in the world of computing had the potential, and they were right, it just took a little longer, to create literally a new economy with new sources of value, quite different and distinct from what was running out of steam by the 1970s. So that constructive collaboration where government, and if you like, funded upstream the trial and error process of discovering the ability to turn lab science into working technology, and then the financial markets amplified and accelerated the commercial deployment of all this new stuff. That configuration was what motivated my original view of this potential very constructive collaboration. And it's a view that I'm not unique in holding. Of course, perhaps in Britain, Mariana Mazzucato is best known, and she and I have a very active continuing conversation on this subject. But of course, when I thought of the three-player game as a kind of working metaphor for the context in which my life as a venture capitalist had evolved, I realized that there was that metaphor related to what the physicists called the three-body problem. The notion of trying to calculate the paths of three planets gravitationally interacting with each other. And the answer that they have always had is that there are an infinite number of configurations, none of which represent a stable equilibrium. And so in this world of political and financial economics has also been the case. And that's where I think we will get to when we are talking about how the state has been delegitimized in the Anglo-American world, at least, as an economic actor, and how we have, particularly in the United States, turned our backs on and ignored the lessons available from this current economic transformation and have instead abdicated from any positive role in the next needed technological revolution, the green, clean revolution, where the U.S. is not even a participant at the national level. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I think that's where this conversation will wind up going.
It will definitely get there, and we will also talk about how China approaches things. I'm curious about this idea. I think Mariana Mazzucato suggests that the state is the investor of first resort. I think is close to her phrase when it comes to raw R&D. And you described how venture capitalists and entrepreneurs come in and amplify that research, and that's certainly what we saw with lots of the kind of core DARPA research, the internet, as you say, being a great example, and there are various things in solid state that came out of UK programs in the 60s and the 70s. But then I'm kind of curious about the distributional aspect of the rewards that come out of this kindling that has been provided by the state. What we've typically done is we've provided, certainly in the UK, tremendous tax breaks for these entrepreneurs and for the investors who pay kind of carried interest, capital gain rates of tax rather than income tax. And I'm sure you as a venture capitalist were under a sort of similar regime. I'm curious about what the agreement was that said, having enabled these core technologies such that they could be amplified, and having provided the institutional frameworks of a legal system and intellectual property law and mechanisms for arbitration and just physical security and a sort of a central bank, we then think that there should be sort of tax breaks and positive treatment in that direction towards the people taking what are now much more limited risks because of the institutional framework that's been provided around the kindling. I mean, you're at the end of a 40-year career in this. When you look back on that, what do you think? The phrase that comes into my mind is from Jerry Cohen, the old philosopher who had that great essay, which is, if you're an egalitarian, how come you're so rich? And I just wonder about how we should be thinking about that dimension.
Well, first of all, I'm addicted to taking the kind of phenomena that we're observing in real time and working to put it into a deeper historical context. Mm-hmm. This is not the first time, that is the digital revolution, is not the first time that the state, and in particular the American state, but also others, have provided the kind of upstream support for the trial and error process of innovation at the frontier, where there will always be failures, more failures than successes, and the pattern of success and the sources of success are fundamentally unpredictable in advance. In Britain, there's actually some really good new research on the extent of government participation in the railway manias of the 1830s and 40s that transformed the British economy. In the U.S., the Erie Canal, which made New York the world's commercial and financial center with something of a lag, was financed by bonds guaranteed by the state of New York. And then on through the whole process of electrification, where the ability to earn a private return from the provision of this basic, fundamental, transformational technology depended on state granting of monopoly privileges to private profit-seeking companies, even while there was an enormous political war over it versus public power. Only with the Tennessee Valley Authority in the U.S. was a national program to bring the benefits of electricity to populations that the private sector had no interest in serving. So there's a long history here. And when we think about the pattern of exploitation of government support by individual capitalists. That history, of course, includes the railway titans of the 19th century, one of whom happened to be named Leland Stanford, and provided some public return to the private gain he made, in good part because of state subsidies in the form of land grants from the federal government. I am sympathetic to the notion of some kind of direct financial feedback from the unpredictable successes. And by the way, this of course would apply as much in the world of biomedicine, biotechnology, where state funding of fundamental research unpredictably has produced enormous positive returns. But there is two things here that I think need to be taken into account. One is, again, terrific academic research on this, much of it led by a British economist at Stanford named Nick Bloom, who also, I'm delighted to say, is a Cambridge University graduate. The social returns from the private gains from investment and innovation dwarf the private returns. Bloom and his team's estimate is as much as 3 to 4 times as much is gained through the spillovers of knowledge and technology and technologies to others and that are not captured by the private profits that are earned. But second, I think that right now more effort should be going into the forward-looking need for state investment, state support, and by the way, not through national champions, but through the kind of open intellectual property and competitive environment that the U.S. Defense Department sponsored in the 1950s and 60s, in direct contrast, by the way, with Britain's narrow focus on a small number of national champions.
Blue Strike and the white heater technology, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that the really important point here is that when these investments are going to be made, nobody knows who's going to be the winner. Mm-hmm. They are, in a way, lottery tickets. And this is my last point on the subject. Mm-hmm. Back in the 70s, we invented out in Silicon Valley, collectively, venture capitalists as a group, what we called Silicon Valley socialism. To induce anyone to leave one of the safe, secure, major companies like Hewlett Packard or Digital Equipment, required the possibility, remote as it might be, of super rewards, lottery tickets. They were actually stock options. And the fact is, the vast majority of those lottery tickets, like lottery tickets in the real world of gambling, expire unexercised. The odds against winning are enormous. But thanks to work from the Harvard Business School, and particularly Michael Jensen, the notion of that these stock options, these lottery tickets, could serve a different purpose, to align executives with their stockholders by making them quasi stockholders, although with only a one-way bet, only upside return, no downside loss, and then distributing those options across established businesses which were not at all in the same context as high-tech startups in Silicon Valley or around the National Institutes of Health. I think that was a terrible, terrible error. And then, of course, when it was extended even to the institutions whose liabilities were more or less guaranteed by taxpayers, institutions known as banks, well, we got what we might have expected. We got enormous risk-taking that went with enormous shortening of the time horizons of the investors, and the executives and the investors were, unfortunately, far too well aligned. But that is a history that does not contradict the notion that to induce the kind of extreme risk-taking necessary at the frontier goes with providing exceptional rewards for success.
So if
oh, by the way, and those rewards should be very, very well taxed. The history of the last 15 years of the last two Republican administrations in aggressively moving to redistribute income from the poor to the rich by way of tax cuts is one of the most destructive examples of what I call the dark side of the three-player game that has emerged so visibly in the last 5 years.
Just a reminder, this podcast is supported by Spotify. They've contributed to making music more accessible in the past decade, and I'm excited about their new feature which brings podcasts closer to listeners all around the world. So find Spotify today and subscribe to the EV podcast there. Now, back to our conversation.
Actually, I think where you've got us to is this idea that in the three-player game, there are times in the three-body problem where a system goes out of its dynamic equilibrium and is unstable, and it feels like we're getting there right now, whether it is this idea of a two-speed economy that we seem to see in the US and in the UK, with cosmopolitan, metropolitan urban centers doing well and other parts of those nations not doing so well, or we start to see things that to a consumer who's watching look like dominant market power. The regulators don't fit the model of dominant market power, the data monopolies in the form of the Facebook and Google and so on. And we also then see, perhaps as a symptom, a growing rise in populism in lots of different countries. Are these things connected?
Unequivocally. And let me just say, the good news about the three-player game is that there is no stable equilibrium anywhere, including the one we're in now. So let me just make 2 points about this. First, historically again, go back 120 years at the end of the 19th century in the Gilded Age, with the enormous power of the John D. Rockefellers and the J.P. Morgans and the Andrew Carnegies, and the dominance from the Second Industrial Revolution of this phenomenal wealth, untaxed, by the way. Income taxes in the U.S. were unconstitutional until a constitutional amendment was passed. But that constitutional amendment was a centerpiece of the progressive political response as the game shifted again against those malefactors of great wealth, as the Republican president Theodore Roosevelt identified them. So I would not give up hope today that we're stuck inevitably in our version of this dark configuration of the three-player game. But the dynamics of where we are right now and the spillover from the impact of the digital revolution on the market economy back into the political process, the way I would describe it is very simply this. Over the last 5-6 years, since the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, through the recovery period, what we've seen is that the digital revolution no longer needs any support or subsidy from government, from the state. On the contrary, it's matured to the point where it is attacking the authority of the state at multiple levels and along multiple dimensions, and even undermining the integrity of the political process on which ultimately the authority of the state rests. The American state in particular, but I think this is also pretty clearly the case in Britain, has proved itself incapable of buffering its constituents against the economic consequences of the digital revolution, which radically reduced friction in the movement of goods and services and people and capital, contributing mightily to the global financial crisis and to the surge of populist rage at the establishments that were benefiting on the one hand and refusing to use the power available to them to distribute those benefits more broadly and to provide transitional support for those who were the victims of the digital revolution. That I see as the driving force of what has shifted the terms of this three-player game into this, thank heavens, unstable, but extremely frustrating and dangerous configuration that we now find ourselves in.
But Bill, I'm curious about that causality. I definitely see that we have a large, a small number of very large, powerful digital companies, the GAFAs, for sake of argument, and Netflix in the US. I also see that the role that Facebook and Twitter may have played in the spread of, agitative propaganda and so on, although it's still a little bit early for the social scientists to come back out and say we actually can find a chain of causality to how election outcomes may have been affected. But I also see, though, that these technology companies have, in general, resulted in the driving down of prices, whether it's Amazon driving down retail prices for products, or Netflix making content available more cheaply than the traditionals, the Barnes and Nobles and the blockbusters. And when I look at what has risen in price in the US over the last 30 years, it's not been computers or books. It's been healthcare and education in particular. And then if you look at what really hammered people's living standards from my reading of the data, it was not the bursting of the dot-com bubble back in 2000, 2001. It was the global financial crisis and the asset deflation, the time locking up of the credit markets, and then certainly in the UK, the move towards austerity in some sense to finance the misdeeds of risk-taking bankers rather than software developers. So I'm just curious about how we connect those two. I mean, how do you, because you seem to connect them together, and I maybe see that they're all happening, but don't see the direct connection.
Well, first of all, the first impact of information technology, of digital technologies on the distribution, and it's your term, that we need to focus on, I agree completely, the distributional consequences of the technological transformations. The first was on engendering the second great globalization. In 1900, as the first great globalization enabled by the technologies of the steamship, the railways, the telegraph, and the telephone, as that took place, world trade as a share of total GDP, total world GDP, reached around 30%, unprecedented.
Mm-hmm.
This time, in 2007, it reached 70%, 70% of world GDP. Second, the whole phenomenon of outsourcing, the opening up of the economies of the developed world to the billions of people who now had access directly or indirectly, whether writing software in India or assembling Apple phones in China, was a transformational impact on labor markets whose consequences can be tracked out long before the global financial crisis. In the U.S., the 80%, the lower 80% ceased to see any increase in real wages, even while productivity continued to grow, beginning roughly in 1980 or a little before.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Great economic historian Peter Temin, in his most recent book, amazingly, and to me with a personal impact, invokes the two-sector theory of economic development associated with the great economist, Sir Arthur Lewis, the first person of color to win the Nobel Prize in Economics, whose course I actually took at Princeton on exactly this subject.
And who was my father's supervisor in the 1950s.
Well, there you go. when he was at LSE, or Manchester.
Manchester, yeah.
And he came to Princeton in time in the 1960s.
Yeah.
the notion that Lewis's theoretical analysis based on real experience in Ghana of economic development in the poorest of the poor countries would be relevant to understanding the dynamics of the American economy is pretty shocking. But so my point here is that indeed, by the time of the global financial crisis, the U.S. economy, and to some material extent the British economy as well, had seen a decoupling of the sharing of the benefits of the wealth produced through growing productivity, even before the global financial crisis, and that was in turn substantially a function of the way that the digital technologies enabled the second great globalization. It went with, in both our countries, it went with the triumph of the Mount Pelerin Society, the libertarians, through the Reagan and Thatcher administration, with the combination of reducing taxation and reducing regulation on the grounds that the markets on their own would deliver stable, beneficial outcomes. And this indeed was formalized in the rational expectations hypothesis that I denounce vigorously in my book, and which I think was substantially discredited indeed by the global financial crisis and the Great Recession. So the political consequences cumulatively built up. And then I couldn't agree with you more. The notion that those directly responsible for the global financial crisis.
So you've level set us, Bill, as to where you think we are, which is that we have this kind of key issue about distribution that is challenging the effectiveness of democracies that are there. They themselves are under the threat of some of these information monopolies. One other thing that you've spoken about is the importance of what you call the next green economy. So given this level setting, what do you think the three-player game needs to look like and deliver in order to move us to a higher energy level and a more sustainable one?
Well, first, like it or not, this does still need to be looked at a national level, not a global level, or even perhaps a super regional level, given the strains and stresses now underway in Europe. But I want to begin this by saying we should really take seriously the historical fact that the coexistence of representative democracy and market capitalism is relatively very recent and obviously fragile. In the 1930s, it came under extreme stress and broke down during the Great Depression in crucially important nations of the world. Of course, Germany being the most extreme, with most extreme consequences. But even in the U.S., it came under extreme stress at both state and national level. Today, it is under extreme stress again. Representative democracy as the kind of institutional response to the emergence of modern market capitalism, with increasing concentration of wealth and capital-intensive industries, as Thomas Piketty's great work, of course, documents. That only emerged in the U.S. around the 1820s, and of course in Britain in the second half of the 19th century, and on the continent even more recently than that. So I don't think we should take for granted that this institutional setup has a permanent life. And of course we see in China's challenge not just an economic challenge, and not just a technological and scientific one, real and substantial as those are, but also an institutional challenge, what I call the three-player game with Chinese characteristics, in which perhaps as an alternative somewhat consciously, somewhat unconsciously, the apparatus that we view through the Orwellian lens, the apparatus of surveillance, not only is available to repress and punish those who create unrest in response to their circumstances, but potentially, and in some cases it would appear evidently, as instruments for finding out what's generating their unrest and doing something about it before it spills over so substantially to threaten the legitimacy of the regime. It certainly is not given that China will succeed, as it clearly intends to attempt to do, succeed the United States as the leader of the innovation economy and a major global player across all of the spectrum of political, economic, financial, institutional relationships. But it certainly has an option to do so. And it's clearly, by its massive investments, both to complete its process of catching up with the West in the existing technologies, but even pushing forward at least co-equally in such areas as machine learning and quantum computing. It is certainly asserting a challenge that I think goes far beyond just the narrow question of trade balances or even intellectual property theft. You know, one of the lessons from history that was examined by the greatest unrecognized economist of the 19th century, Friedrich List, German economist of national economic development, was that every follower nation begins by appropriating the intellectual property that it can get its hands on.
Absolutely.
And the China, we did it to Britain in the textile industry, and the Japanese and Koreans returned the favor to us. Chinese have done it in a more organized and perhaps prioritized way, even more than the Japanese did. But now they're reaching the frontier. And I think we're going to see that China begins to enforce patent and copyright laws rather more substantially when its own nationals are at the frontier, just as the U.S. did in the 19th century with respect to copyright, when we got authors as popular as Mark Twain who took over from Charles Dickens, whose works were pirated mercilessly in the United States.
They were indeed, and I wonder about whether the fact that we've spent much of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century living under the shadow of the neoclassical synthesis and its particular view on the state, that it's created a sort of strategic blindness when we assess and has to have in recent historical times assessed what is possible under what you might call the Chinese innovation consensus. Because what strikes me about what China is able to do in this area is it's able to coordinate the large-scale technology platforms through soft and hard direction. It's able to be a little bit less squeamish about the rights of the individual, which provides it a data advantage, and it can coordinate municipal and state and government level in investment in a way that actually has probably been they can do better than many other states. And I wonder whether we will look back in 10 or 15 years and realize that there was a completely different way to play the three-player game, which comes to the cost to sort of certain things that are enshrined in our, J.S. Mill, Thomas Paine, inspired political philosophies. But I have a couple of relatives over from Pakistan at the moment, and they tell me that as you walk around the streets of Islamabad, you regularly see Chinese business execs who have perfect Urdu or Punjabi as they pay with the CPAC relationship. And so it's the free-play game could potentially be played in a different way, and that might be what's unfolding here.
Well, that's exactly what I've set out, as I say, what I call the three-player game with Chinese characteristics. It is not given that within that enormous, populous and highly diverse society, much more diverse than we recognize, that top-down control, even with the ability to deploy all of these digital technologies operating in real time, will produce a coherent, stable, successful outcome. But I think two things are the case. First of all, I do want to go back and insist that certainly in the Western world and even in the Chinese world, the notion of a politically legitimizing mission, not just correcting market failure in the spirit of the welfare economics and the work of the great Professor Arthur Perdue of Cambridge, that's not enough, that the politically legitimizing mission, historically national development, national security, is necessary to generate sufficient consensus to overcome the distributional conflicts that are necessarily generated by economic development and growth. In the West, we did, by and large, not entirely, lose something of that concept of a politically legitimizing mission. But I do have to call out that in 1972, we can date, in effect, the sources of the biotechnology revolution to Richard Nixon's declaration of war on cancer. Now, that war has been going on for 45 years with occasional limited, somewhat haphazard success. But by invoking the language of war, what Nixon was saying is prospective cost-benefit analysis will not constrain or limit investments in the necessary, highly uncertain process of trial and error and error. Because it's a war that has the potential to benefit all, again, it overrides distributional conflict over who gets the money, who captures the rents from that government investment.
You know, it's funny you described that process, because I've been thinking a little bit about quantum computing for the past few weeks. And the thing that surprises me is that quantum computing, if we can get it to work, can bring trillions, quadrillions fold improvement to computation, and we can start to solve all sorts of problems we can't even imagine today. So it could have that effect of raising all boats everywhere. And then when you look at the scale of investment in quantum computing right now, it's quite small. I mean, there's a handful of companies, IBM and Microsoft and some startups. In total, they've got fewer than a couple of thousand people working in this area. And so companies have made relatively small investments. Venture capitalists have made small investments because they can't see a payback in less than 10 years. And this seems to be exactly the kind of place where the third player in your three-player game, the mission-driven state, should be standing up and saying the social benefits of getting this working are so enormous we need to step in, because otherwise it's in no one's interest short-term to develop this. And what do you think about that?
Dave, you are right as rain. And in fact, to illustrate graphically that we're on the same page, if you were to hold up the jacket of the first edition of my book, you would see an icon. It's a generic smartphone, very carefully designed by the Cambridge University Press not to look exactly like an Apple iPhone, since we certainly did not want to disturb that very restless giant. But it was a generic smartphone designed in the United States, whether in the iPhone or the Android version. Then The new edition also has an icon. It could not be more different. It's a photograph, rather a designer's image of the Chinese satellite that demonstrated quantum communications through entangled photons over 3,000 kilometers, demonstrating that at least in this domain, China was already at the frontier. And as you say, a frontier of exploring the technological consequences of science that require absolutely underwriting at scale by government. I have to say that important as I think quantum computing can be, to me the failure that is most frustrating is the failure to provide the equivalent scale of support for the needed energy-related technologies, particularly energy storage technologies, to enable the green revolution. And here China is also deeply engaged with state funding and support of private research and innovation, and the U.S. to a much, much, much lesser extent. I always like to call out that the budget of DARPA even today remains $3 billion a year. The budget of the ARPA energy initiative in the Department of Energy that Trump wants to close down has never reached as much as $300 million, less than a tenth of DARPA's budget.
Yeah, it's a misplaced priority, which I think you can only write down to vested interests who want to maintain the value of carbon assets.
I think that there's a great deal to do that, as well as the overall rejection of the positive economic role for the state. But Azeem, before we conclude, I would like to add a kind of coda to this conversation, as I did to my book, because the fellow who hired me, John Vogelstein, who hired me at Warburg Pincus 30 years ago, used to say that you can't survive as a venture capitalist if you're a pessimist. And temperamentally, I am an optimist, and I can find one domain where optimism, I think, is mandated, long-term positive consequences, and that is in the domain of ideas. And it's particularly the manner in which it's now apparent that the global financial crisis was, for the disciplines of economics and finance, the academic disciplines, the gift that keeps on giving, and the constructive, creative response across a very broad range of economic research, both empirical and theoretical, to the global financial crisis and the consequent Great Recession, offers the possibility, looking forward, of redefining the context in which the kind of public policy issues we've been discussing will be debated in the future for the very great benefit of us all. That's my optimistic coda.
Well, like you, Bill, I'm an optimist. I think it's very hard to maintain an ongoing level of pessimism. It would make you a very miserable person. Just as a last final question to you, you've been a fantastic guest. If I'm going to bring somebody else on, whether it's an amazing founder or an academic, anyone from any other domain onto this podcast, who would be your number one recommendation?
Well, right now, I actually think it would be the new Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, Diane Coyle. Diane is a student of the digital economy. She's contributing powerfully to the attempt to understand, to take apart and analyze what we haven't discussed directly, the productivity puzzle, all of this digital technology in the context of very slow recorded statistical growth and productivity. But she's also has a very broad-ranging interest. I would strongly recommend Diane Coyle as a guest for you, Azeem.
I'll absolutely chat to Diane. She's been a long-term reader of Exponential View, herself, and actually edited one of the issues a few months ago when I was on vacation for me. So I'll drop her an email. Thank you very much, Bill.
Thanks for sharing the past hour with me and Bill. If you have any questions or thoughts you'd like to share about our conversation, tweet at Azeem and at Bill Janeway, or follow me on my newsletter from www.exponentialview.co. And as always, rate, review and recommend the podcast to your friends. I look forward to hearing from you.